Imagine waking up before the sun rises, in a house so cold you can see your breath, eating whatever small amount of food your mother could scrape together, and then walking for an hour in the dark to arrive at a hole in ground. You're 8 years old. You will spend the next 12 hours underground. You will not see daylight again until the work is done. And when you finally emerge, black with cold dust, your lungs already absorbing damage that will shorten your life by decades, you will hand every coin you earn directly to your father because the law says your wages belong to him. You will do this tomorrow. You will do this the day after. You will do this every day until your body breaks or the law finally changes, whichever comes first. This was not a rare tragedy in Victorian England. This was the daily reality for hundreds of thousands of boys, some as young as 5, who descended into the coal mines that powered the most industrially advanced civilization on Earth. And the story of how this was allowed to happen, how it was justified, and why it took so long to stop is one of the most revealing chapters in the entire history of childhood. To understand why Victorian boys were sent into mines before they were old enough to read, you have to understand what childhood itself meant in the early 19th century. The modern idea of childhood as a protected period of development, a time set aside for education, play, and gradual preparation for adult life, did not exist in any meaningful way for working-class families in Victorian England. Childhood was not a phase. It was simply a period of smaller, weaker labor that would eventually become larger, stronger labor. A boy who was big enough to carry something was big enough to work. A boy who was old enough to follow simple instructions was old enough to earn. The question was never whether a child should contribute economically to the family. The question was only what kind of contribution his size and age made possible. For families living in the mining regions of Wales, Yorkshire, Durham, and the Scottish coalfields, the answer to that question pointed underground almost as soon as a boy could walk steadily. The mines needed workers who were small, not because the work required less strength, but because the tunnels themselves, particularly in the older and less developed collieries, were cut low to follow the seams of coal through the rock. An adult could not fit into many of the passages where the coal actually was. A child could. This physical fact transformed small bodies from a liability into an asset, and the industrial economy did what industrial economies do with assets. It extracted from them as efficiently as possible for as long as possible with as little cost as it could manage. The jobs given to the youngest boys were called trapper jobs, and understanding what a trapper actually did tells you everything you need to know about how the Victorian mining industry thought about child labor. A trapper's job was to sit alone in a dark tunnel, sometimes for 12 hours at a stretch, beside a wooden door that regulated the flow of air through the mine. When a coal cart needed to pass, the trapper opened the door. When the cart was through, he closed it again. That was the entire job. It required no skill, no training, and almost no physical strength. What it required was a small body willing to sit in complete darkness for most of a working day, breathing air that contained coal dust, methane, and carbon monoxide in proportions that no adult regulator would have permitted in any other context. Boys as young as 5 were given this job. They sat in the dark, often for the first time far underground, and they were expected to stay awake and alert because a trapper who fell asleep and left a door open could disrupt the ventilation in a way that allowed gas to accumulate, which could kill every person working in that section of the mine. The psychological dimension of this is worth pausing on. These are not simply tired children doing dull work. These were young boys placed alone in underground darkness for hours at a time, responsible for a task whose consequences they could not fully comprehend, in an environment filled with sounds, smells, and physical sensations that no child's nervous system was equipped to process calmly. The testimonies collected by parliamentary commissioners in the early 1840s are full of descriptions from boys who described talking to themselves in the dark to stay awake, who said they were frightened for most of the working day, who described hearing noises they could not identify and having no one nearby to ask. Some children brought mice or other small animals underground with them for company. The commissioners, many of whom were encountering the reality of child mine labor for the first time, described being visibly disturbed by what they found. As boys grew older and larger, The work they were given changed, but it did not become safer or kinder. Hurriers, who were typically boys between 8 and 16, were responsible for moving the coal from the coalface, where it was cut to the base of the shaft, where it could be lifted to the surface. They did this by pushing or pulling heavy wooden carts along iron rails through tunnels that were often so low they had to crouch or crawl. The carts were loaded with coal that could weigh several hundred pounds. The tunnels were often wet, sometimes flooded at ankle or knee depth. The temperature underground varied wildly between sections of the mine, with some areas near underground fires dangerously hot and others near ventilation shafts cold enough to cause hypothermia in a wet, underfed child. Hurriers were often harnessed to the carts with leather straps around their waists and between their legs, pulling like animals while they crawled forward on hands and knees through passages too low to stand in. The physical damage this caused to developing spines, hips, and knees was extensive and permanent, and it was documented in clinical detail by the doctors who examined mine workers in later life and found in them a distinctive pattern of skeletal deformity that told the story of years of underground labor begun in childhood. The question of why families allowed this, and in many cases actively sent their sons into the mines, cannot be answered without confronting the economic reality of working-class life in the early Victorian period. These were families operating on the absolute edge of survival. A family whose father worked in the mine earned enough to eat and to keep a roof overhead, but only barely, and only if nothing went wrong. Illness, injury, a drop in coal prices, a mine closure. Any of these events could push a family from precarious stability into genuine destitution within weeks. In this context, the wages earned by a child, even the small wages paid to a trapper, were not supplementary income. They were the difference between the family eating adequately and not eating adequately. Mothers who sent their young sons underground were not indifferent to their suffering. Many of them had grown up in mining communities themselves, had lost fathers and brothers and husbands to mining accidents, and understood exactly what they were sending their children into. They sent them anyway because the alternative was worse, and the alternative was starvation. This economic coercion was understood perfectly well by the mine owners who employed child labor, and it shaped their resistance to reform with remarkable cynicism. When parliamentary reformers began pushing for legislation to limit the use of children in mines, the owners argued consistently that restricting child labor would destroy the economic viability of mining families, that would remove from poor families their only means of earning a living wage, and that the reformers were therefore not protecting children, but harming them by removing their ability to contribute to family income. This argument was made with complete seriousness by men who were paying children pennies for 12 hours of dangerous underground work, and who had no intention of raising adult wages to compensate for the lost child labor income. The concern for mining families expressed by mine owners in parliamentary debates was entirely instrumental. It existed only as a rhetorical device to protect a labor arrangement that was extraordinarily profitable precisely because children cost so little. The publication of the Children's Employment Commission report in 1842 changed the public conversation about child mine labor in a way that the previous decades of reform agitation had not quite managed. The report included detailed written testimonies from children describing their working conditions in their own words, and it included illustrations, drawings made from the commissioner's observations, that showed children harnessed to coal carts, crawling through flooded tunnels, sitting alone in underground darkness. These images circulated through the press and reached middle and upper-class audiences who had no direct connection to mining communities and who were genuinely shocked by what they saw. The visual impact of the illustrations was significant in a way that statistical arguments about injury rates and mortality figures had not been. Seeing a drawing of a small boy chained to a coal cart in a tunnel too low to stand and produced a different kind of response than reading a table of accident statistics. The Mines Act of 1842, which followed directly from the Commission's report, prohibited women and girls from working underground and set the minimum age for underground work by boys at 10 years old. This was presented as a significant reform, and in some respects it was. But it is worth being precise about what it did and did not accomplish. It did not end child labor in the mines. It moved the legal floor from no floor at all to the age of 10, which meant that the practice of sending 8 and 9-year-olds underground became illegal, but the practice of sending 10, 11, and 12-year-olds underground remained entirely legal and continued largely unchanged. Boys who had been working underground since age 7 or 8 would now, in theory, have to wait until age 10, but the enforcement mechanisms for the new law were almost non-existent in its early years. Inspectors were few, mines were many, and the economic incentive for mine owners to continue employing younger children where they could was not removed by passing a law without providing serious means of enforcing it. The gradual tightening of child labor law across the second half of the 19th century, raising minimum ages and reducing permitted working hours, was real and it mattered. But the pace of change was determined less by the suffering of children and more by the shifting economic calculations of industrialists who were beginning to invest in mechanization that could replace some of the tasks previously performed by child labor, and by the growing political power of working-class men who were beginning to organize through trade unions and to see child labor partly as a mechanism that suppressed adult wages by providing an alternative supply of cheaper workers. The reform of child labor in Victorian mines was the result of multiple forces pushing in the same direction, and the well-being of children was only one of those forces, and not always the most powerful one. What the children themselves experienced, and what they carried with them into adulthood, is harder to quantify than mortality statistics or parliamentary voting records, but it is not invisible. The memoirs and oral histories collected from men who had worked in Victorian mines as children describe a particular kind of formation, a personality shaped by early exposure to genuine danger, physical hardship, total economic dependency, and the specific psychology of underground labor. Many described a complete absence of the experience of being a child in any recognizable sense. They had not played in any sustained way. They had not had time to be curious about the world at the surface because the world at the surface was never fully available to them. Their bodies bore permanent physical marks of the work, curved spines, damaged lungs, scarred hands, knees that never worked correctly after years of crawling. And many described a resignation, a particular flatness in their relationship to the idea of personal future. That makes sense when you understand that they had been inserted into an industrial system before they were old enough to imagine any alternative to it. The real reason Victorian boys were forced to work in mines before the age of 10 is not ultimately a simple answer. It is a web of interlocking causes, a legal system that did not recognize children as rights-bearing individuals deserving protection, an economic system that valued the extraction of labor above the development of human beings, a class structure that made the children of the poor available for uses that the children of the wealthy were entirely shielded from, and a cultural framework that had not yet developed the concept of childhood as something worth protecting for its own sake. All of these things had to be true simultaneously for what happened in those mines to be possible. And understanding that it took all of them working together to produce this outcome is important, because it means that removing any single one of them would not have been sufficient to stop it. Change required challenging the whole structure at once, which is why it was so slow, so contested, and so incomplete even when it finally arrived.